the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. Arthur Neumann's Overdose of Elephant by Peter Hathaway Capstick. Author's Introduction. Arthur Neumann is still considered by many historians of the ivory trade as the beau ideal of professional elephant hunters. The only book he wrote, Elephant Hunting in East Equatorial Africa, is highly prized and rare Africana. It has pride of place in my hunting library. This book is as rare as the ivory Arthur Neumann took under the most primitive and difficult of conditions in early East Africa. A British hunter, despite his surname, Neumann's prowess as an elephant hunter and the financial gain he achieved rank him among the geniuses of that bloodiest and possibly most dangerous of trades. Neumann killed his first elephant in February 1894 in the vicinity of Mount Kenya, and was to spend several years pursuing elephant, often taking huge risks. His tribal African name was Nyama Yangu, meaning my meat. This was distilled by his black African staff to indicate that once Neumann decided on a tusker, it was as good as dead. Unfortunately, he ran across a big cow jumbo who had similar convictions. The spirit of Arthur Neumann certainly lives on in the estimation of anybody who has ever hunted elephant or who has ever heard of him. The whine of mosquitoes is eerie and thin in the moist, heavy air on the morning of January 11th, 1896. In the snaggled bush that borders the swamp along the northeast tip of Kenya Colony's Lake Rudolph, professional ivory hunter Arthur Neumann and two black gun-bearers, Juma and Squareface, are walking fast to cut off a retreating herd of elephants, three of which now lie in crumpled heaps, slowly seeping gore back in the stands of dense Meswaki scrub. It hasn't been a very good morning. Two of the timbo are light-tusked cows, the other a young bull with teeth only 25 pounds per side. Still, thinks Neumann, small ivory is better than none. It has been nearly 2 weeks since his last kill, the past 10 nights of which have been stalked by nightmares of the horrible death of Shibane on New Year's Day. He has only to close his eyes to conjure up the image that will remain dark and awful for the rest of his days, the last moment of agonized life for his dead and thoroughly disposed of Swahili servant. It had not been far from here, just to the north, on the banks of the Nyan River, where it flows into the vastness of Great Lake Rudolph, the dark, murky current, slow and casual as a swimming python. Twice that day, Neumann had himself taken a bath in the river, first at noon and then again near sundown, when he was accompanied by Shibane. The hunter had washed and dried himself and was lacing up his boots, noticing that the Swahili had also gone into the water to bathe. Neumann finished tying his laces and was busy gathering up his things when the soft, quiet twilight was disemboweled by a saw-toothed shriek of pain and shock. Jerking around, he was stunned to see Shibane full in the jaws of a huge crocodile, lifted free of the water by his midriff, like a fish in the beak of a heron, he remembered. Nothing for it. When the swirls ceased and the blossoms of blood had blended with the current, the river was again as if nothing had ever happened. Shibane had been killed not 35 feet from where Neumann himself had been bathing mere moments before. Deeply depressed and likely not a little frightened by the deadly causality of kismet, Neumann has had trouble these past days getting the sight out of his mind. Still, it was good to be back to the business of hunting, even if the ivory was nothing but toothpick stuff. A narrow path runs along the edge of the swamp, no more than a thin sword stroke through the looming growth, as the men hurry along, anxious for another shot before the herd breaks off and heads into the heart of the swamp itself. Neumann is not thinking of the Shibane now, but of the little .303 Lee Metford service rifle in his sweating hands. Over the 2.5 years he has been hunting elephant professionally, he has found that smaller herd animals such as these can be handled by the very light caliber successfully, saving his expensive express cartridges. After all, he is a professed small-bore man himself. Instead of the more standard 10-bore elephant guns, 775 caliber, considered minimum by other pros, he has been laughed at for preferring the Pipsqueak 577 Black Powder Express with its 750-grain solid bullet. Such are the times. But there's something wrong with the feeding mechanism of the .303, an annoying fault that a couple of times this morning has permitted the spent brass to be extracted and ejected, yet has not picked up a fresh round from the top of the magazine and chambered it. There is no time to switch rifles, though. In a few minutes, the herd will be gone. Pulling ahead of Juma and Squareface, Arthur Neumann runs down the trail and smack into the biggest mistake he will ever live to make. It's not the first time he has seen her, a 3-ton cow with a half-grown calf at heel. She has already shown very definite signs of aggressiveness by a short charge earlier, but Neumann had spared her because of her small tusks and her calf, cutting the wind to avoid her rush. 2 other elephants with her continue down the trail. Not her. With a silence that is in itself awesome, she immediately charges from close range, her trunk low, her speed churning up the few yards that separate her from the hated man. Arthur Neumann has no choice this time, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Centering his sights on the spot that will pile her up in the frontal brain shot, he squeezes the trigger. The hollow, muffled, metallic click of the firing pin falling on the empty chamber is the loudest thing he has ever heard. Arthur H. Neumann lived in South Africa for 24 years before taking up ivory hunting in British East Africa in 1893. From his classic book, Hunting the Elephant in East Equatorial Africa, the modern hunter can gain an unusually clear view of what it was like to be a member of what, on any basis, was one of the most elite companies of adventurers ever to penetrate a wilderness. Considering the hardships and dangers to which these men were exposed almost every day and the number who died or were killed in the field, it seems reasonable to conclude that there were easier ways of making a living than elephant hunting. Still, a lucky, skillful man could make his fortune in a few years. If he lived, that is. Neumann only hunted 3 years, taking 2 expeditions up the east shore of Lake Rudolph and back. Given what happened to him, his retirement after such a short career is not hard to understand. One wonders if the mere click of an ivory billiard ball or the tinkle of piano keys would not have been enough to cause him clammy palms in his later years, in which he achieved fame not only for his book, but also for discovering a new species of hartebeest, which was named for him, as well as for his work in the field of butterfly collecting. At this moment, though, and for some time to come, it is most doubtful whether Arthur Neumann will have any later years. He knows he's a dead man. With the chamber empty and the vicious cow almost on top of him, there is no choice but to run back down the slender corridor of thick bush that encloses the path as effectively as the walls of a brick alley. As he flees the pounding death behind, terror twisting his guts with cold fingers, he makes one last panicked effort to work the bolt, snapping the broken rifle back in the direction of the elephant without pausing to aim. Again, the ominous click. Dropping the rifle, he takes his last chance and hurls himself off the trail into the undergrowth, praying that the cow will pass him by. It's not Neumann's day. She hauls up in a cloud of debris and is on him instantly. As Neumann tries to leap through the bush, the impact spins him around, and he's lying on his back, supported by some springy brushwood, his feet pointing toward the path so he has a lovely, uncluttered view of the proceedings. Kneeling over him, the enraged elephant lunges 3 times. Neumann's head is battered by the base of the trunk. large sheets of skin torn away by the rough contact, but his skull is somehow not crushed. Possibly the brush absorbs some of the shock. Then the tusks drive home, wrist-thick spikes as sharp as fresh-cut tent pegs that rip and punch completely through his right arm's bicep, piercing until the ivory hits the dirt below. The other tusk lances him in the chest, stabbing him through the rib cage as the massive head pounds and grinds his chest, crushing and separating ribs. And then she's gone. Does she think the blood-covered man is dead? She'd certainly have reason to. Perhaps she's worried about her calf. No matter. She abandons the tattered half-corpse and goes back down the trail. Incredibly, Neumann is able to stand up and discover that he has no broken arms or legs. Later he finds that the cow has stepped on the buttock of the Lee Metford, leaving clear toenail scars in the wood, but the treacherous little gun is unharmed. Upon calling them, he sees his gun bearers come up, Squareface bursting into tears at the grisly sight of his master. Neumann is a bit miffed that neither of the men who were armed fired a shot, but forgives them in the light of past loyalty. There is little value in following the day-to-day agonies of the mutilated Arthur Neumann over his long recovery. Completely out of reach of help, he should have died from blood loss, shock, internal injuries, and such on the spot. But he didn't. Having himself carried back to the camp, he spent the next days and weeks wondering just when death would come. As he waited, he nearly went west with terrible fever brought on by becoming chilled from water poured over his wounds to cool them and then being left lying in the wet when he would pass out. Gradually, the tusk hole in his arm began to close without infection, although he was unable to sleep or even sit comfortably for weeks because of the pain. The smashed ribs healed themselves naturally, and the wound began to heal over. How the tusk missed the lung has never been explained. On February 5th, practically insane with pain, boredom, heat, and constant rain, he rose from his cot to kill a topi antelope, which he knocked over with his second shot. Unfortunately, the exertion brought on a complete relapse, and he spent another month suffering the hell of malaria and a world record dose of galloping dysentery. Practically a skeleton, he at last nursed himself back to marginal health on native milk and eggs from a nearby village. By June, Neumann and his safari had hunted back to El Bagoy on the southern route back to Mombasa. His troubles were by no means over, although he had collected some exceptional ivory. Here, while stoking a campfire, he got a thorn in his right hand that became infected, quickly turning to blood poisoning. Now, Neumann was a fairly low-key sort about his own problems, so when he writes that he was in such agony that he seriously considered amputating the hand himself, you can bet your lunch money that he was mighty uncomfortable. The hand got worse daily until it was swollen all the way up his arm like a giant, psychedelically painted knackwurst. Having one of his men lance it deeply with a hunting knife must have been outstandingly unpleasant. The operation did not help, and probably complicated things further. Eventually, the palm and the back of the hand burst and drained. This whole process took another month, during which time he was confined to camp in awful straits. Even the draining of the hand and arm did little good besides relieving the painful pressure, as both were now half the normal size and completely useless. Eventually they healed, but were stiff for as long as Neumann lived. Incidentally, the only reference he makes to the problem once the hand burst is a casual mention of how really easy it was to learn to write with his left. Neumann and the late lamented Shebane were not the only ones to come to grief on the second Lake Rudolph expedition. At 1:15 on a dark morning, not long before the end of the safari and safety, the gun-bearer Squareface was killed and eaten by an enterprising man-eating lion, taken from inside a thorn enclosure close by where Neumann slept. As I said, it was a heck of a way to make a living. End of Arthur Neumann's Overdose of Elephant by Peter Hathaway Capstick. All I can say is, wow, what a man. What a different generation. Thank you so much for listening, and Godspeed.